Okay, so I think we'll make a start, and then if people join us, that's fine. They can we can let them in as and when they arrive. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us as part of the Media Cultures series of talks. So Media Cultures is a research cluster based at the University of Leicester in the School of Media Communication and Sociology. My name's Gilly Kay. I'm one of the co-leaders of the cluster, and my colleague Ed Vollens, who will be with us at certain points during this talk, is another co-leader of the cluster. And we're really pleased today to be hosting Dr. Claire Sedgwick as part of our series of talks this semester. So for those of you that don't know Claire, she is an honorary research fellow at the University of Nottingham. Her current research is on comedy and precarity, and it's funded by a British Academy Leverhulme Small Research Grant. And she's going to be talking today about the cultural economy of comedy in the East Midlands, which is coming out of this project. Her first book, Feminist Media from the Second Wave to the Digital Age, was published in 2020, and that's another sort of strand of her research interests. Well, I guess her major research interests are in feminist media studies, and this is a kind of new, I think, area for her research that she's moving into. So we're really excited to hear about her work today. So she's going to talk for about half an hour. And then there will be a chance for Q&A at the end. Please feel free to use the chat box to ask your questions. You can also raise your hand and share your mic, so there'll be plenty of time at the end for lots of questions and discussion. Just to let you know, you should be able to see already that the session is recording, but just to make you aware of that, so it will be made publicly available after today. If for any reason you'd like your participation edited out, then that's absolutely fine. Just let me know and we can easily do that. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Claire. So yeah, whenever you're ready, Claire, looking forward to hearing it.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm just getting it up there. So thank you for coming. So this is a presentation on my current research project, which is on the cultural economy of comedy in the East Midlands, which you can't really say if you're drunk because it becomes a bit of a mouthful, but it's okay to do because I've only had tea. So just to start us off then, a bit of background. It's a British Academy Leverhulme project. It began in May 2020, which is quite frankly the worst possible time for a piece of research on a cultural industry to have started, given that we are, and we were in the midst and still are in the midst of a global pandemic, but there we are. And the aim is to speak to comedians from the East Midlands at least 3 times, and with 10 interviewees, so to have around 30 interviews in total. So far I've spoken to 9 comedians, and I'm just in the process of starting to do kind of follow-up interviews of them. But as I'll go on to explain, some of the schedules that I had in mind for doing the project were completely threw out of the window quite quickly. So a lot of the way that I envisaged the project progressing has had to shift because a lot of the kind of the significant points through the year that I was going to ask comedians about were no longer that significant, given that a lot of them haven't been gigging live in a comedy venue for a year now. So the research questions then is, how do comedians in the East Midlands manage a career in comedy? What are the challenges in working in comedy, specifically in the East Midlands? So, is there something regional about the comedy industry that we can talk about? How do comedians in the East Midlands support themselves financially, and can they sustain themselves through comedy alone? So can we think about comedy as a sustainable career? And then how do gender, class, race impact the ability to develop a comedy career? And some of this comes out of my own very, very limited experience. So in 2017, I did a very short comedy course when I was a PhD student, and then did a very small amount of gigs. And what I found was that as soon as I told someone that's what I was doing, they would be like, oh, so are you going to be on TV? And I'd be like, no, because that's not how it works. So I'm really interested in this kind of, the separation between what we imagine the career looks like, in terms of the general public sees people at the very kind of at the apex of their career when they've finally got on TV and they're on live at the Apollo. But they maybe don't see the things that happened before then. And they also, I think crucially, don't see the people that maybe don't get through it because of kind of structural inequalities to do with class, gender, race, and also kind of ability as well. So I'm really interested in that as kind of as a kind of an area to look at. So I think it would be kind of remiss for me to not talk about COVID as much as I would like not to. It has had a huge impact on the project, which I'm still trying to kind of untangle and consider how that impacts on the kind of things that are going to come out of the project, also the research questions themselves, and also some of the ethics around doing research in the time of COVID. So the first thing is that it's had a massive impact on methods. So obviously interviewing us all had to be done online. In some respects, that's not a terrible thing, because it normalises the fact that people that maybe are not able to travel for in-person interviews, that no longer seems like an exception, and that becomes kind of the norm. So we can see how there are some benefits in that, but then obviously the disadvantages is that some of the things that you get from face-to-face in-person interactions you don't quite get. There is that barrier of a screen, and I'm interested to think about kind of what impact that's had, and I'm sure that there'll be a lot of research that comes out over the next couple of years which will talk about that, so I'm keeping a good eye on that. The second is some of the questions that I ask mean quite different things now. So I have a set of questions that I would, it was a semi-structured interview, but I had a set of questions that I put in my ethics application that were like, this is generally what I'm going to talk about. And some of those were things like, how often do you gig? When was your last gig? Do you go to festivals? And obviously for the past year, comedians haven't really been able to answer that question in the same way, because there was maybe a small period of time in the summer when some gigs started to happen, but we're talking, weeks rather than months, especially in Leicester in particular, because obviously Leicester has been under enhanced kind of lockdown measures for pretty much the past year. So speaking to a lot of comedians in the Leicester region, the question of when did you last gig becomes, much more complicated than it would be normally. The interview schedule therefore went out the window. So originally the plans for my interviews were structured around two main events in the year. So the first was the Leicester Comedy Festival, which is in February. The idea was to interview people around that time, especially those within kind of, because it's an East Midlands focus, so that's kind of Leicester, Nottingham, and that region, and then to interview them around the time of the Edinburgh Festival, with the anticipation of being able to ask people who are going up to Edinburgh about their experiences of that, because I am aware that it's quite a costly festival to go to, and there are a lot of discussions around the kind of the cost benefit analysis of that. It became really clear quite early on that that wasn't going to happen. So obviously the Edinburgh Fringe Festival did not happen at all last year, so asking people about that no longer made any sense. But it has also meant that I've been able to talk to people who wouldn't have necessarily gone to either of those festivals, and we have still talked about Edinburgh, for example, and there is maybe a benefit of talking about it now because they can talk about past experiences rather than just talking about what's happened this year. So I'm trying to see the positives in that respect. And then I think this is one that the main thing that I've grappled with is the ethical considerations around this. So we are at a massive time of uncertainty, as you will be more than aware, the cultural and creative industries have been massively hit by the pandemic. A lot of people have missed out on kind of funding for self-employed people because of the way that their work is kind of split between, the amount of, the tax return from the previous year. So there's been a lot of things that have happened that have meant that this is a really challenging time, both in terms of financially, but I think more crucially in terms of the identity work that goes on around, you know, how you identify as being a part of a particular profession. And obviously for comedians, like a lot of other kind of, you know, like a lot of other professions, if we want to call it that, have not been able, you know, to do what they want to do. And so I've been kind of grappling with, on the one hand, wanting to document that and thinking it's really important that we consider the impact of COVID, but on the other hand, not wanting for it to even to be too voyeuristic and causing kind of upset at a time when people are already kind of struggling through it. So I'm still at that kind of, I'm still a bit on the fence about that. So I'd be really interested in what other people think about that. So that's kind of getting that out there. COVID-19 has been an interesting time to start your first big research project. So great timing. So moving on from that then, the Live Comedy Association, who are quite a new body that came out of some of the responses to the pandemic from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, for example, and the Arts Council. So they're a new lobbying body that kind of came into fruition as a response to that. And they commissioned a survey last year, and they found that a third of comedy venues believe they will be forced to close within the next 6 months, and 77.8% are facing closure within the next year. I think it's important at this point to note that a lot of venues are also pubs. So we've got the fact that pubs are, you know, under massive pressure, and then the pubs are acting as the venues for the comedy nights that are also under massive kind of pressure and strain. So it's kind of a bit of a double whammy in that respect. 45% of respondents have already had serious thoughts to leave comedy because of the pandemic, with just under 60% of respondents predicting they'll need to leave before February 2021 unless we're able to get back to performances. Obviously, the survey was commissioned last year. We're now past February 2021. We've had no significant return to live comedy since then, so we can kind of think about how those numbers might be affected further. 83% of promoters don't think they will run all of their regular events after lockdown ends, and we can think about the effect that has on the kind of pipeline in terms of, you know, the fewer events there are, the more competition there is, and that has a constricting effects on the industry as well. And I think this is an important one. Over 75% of performers have earned less than 5% of their pre-pandemic estimated income from online performance of any kind. So some of the people I've spoken to have really enjoyed doing online comedy, but we can't, you know, as much as that is kind of a valid outlet, it's not bringing in the same revenue as performing on stage would. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that we can unpick. But I think that's important because it kind of suggests that just telling people to go online is not an adequate replacement for the kind of living that they were making at live gigs in person. And then 73.5% of respondents have found their mental health negatively impacted by job and industry uncertainty during the pandemic, which I think goes back to my previous point, which is about the kind of the duty of care as an interviewer, about bringing up these conversations at a time where people are suffering quite negatively, you know, in terms of their mental health. So it's not a particularly rosy picture, but I think important thing to say is it wasn't a particularly rosy picture before COVID. I think that's kind of the application for this was put in October of 2019. So we were already having these conversations and these discussions around kind of precarity. So the pandemic has essentially exacerbated a problem that was already there. And I think that's an important thing to kind of consider, because I think, you know, because what that means is that after the pandemic, there are still problems that we need to solve, even if things go back to, you know, quote unquote normal. In terms of the project, a few things. So I chose to look at the East Midlands for a few reasons. There's a couple of relatively big cities there, Leicester and Nottingham. It's the Leicester Comedy Festival is there. It's the biggest comedy festival in Europe, and that's, you know, and it's a big draw to kind of the city every year. So I was interested in what impact that had, if any, on kind of people that work in the industry year round. And then I think crucially the Midlands, and I think probably specifically the East Midlands, is often left out of discussions around kind of culture because of the idea of the North-South divide. And I think sometimes the Midlands doesn't quite fit into those narratives. And we see that sometimes, for example, in the recent discussions around kind of levelling up. Often that kind of, that's framed as kind of North and South, and the Midlands doesn't quite fit in there. So I think that's an important thing to kind of consider. And then the final one is just proximity. I used to live in Leicester. I know a lot of comedians in the area, so it was a bit of a no-brainer in terms of I had a lot of access, and it's made interviews a lot easier because people kind of already know who I am, so they're not kind of coming to me. I'm not coming to them kind of without that prior relationship. And then why comedy? So it's a massive creative industry. It makes millions and millions of pounds for lots of people, but not for most of the people that perform in it. It's historically not being considered for Arts Council funding. So back in 2015, this article on The Stage talks about its decision not to fund comedy. The DCMS funding, which was administered by the Arts Council as part of the Cultural Recovery Fund, did in fact fund some comedy projects. So the Leicester Comedy Festival, for example, was the recipient, and some of the comedy clubs were in some events. But in comparison to other forms of art, that's very much unusual for comedy to receive any funding. And there has been a lot of discussion around kind of the lack of diversity within the industry, and I guess my kind of aim is to look at how structural inequalities in terms of access, in terms of being able to kind of weather the precarity that is inherent in the industry structures, mean that actually for a lot of people, it's quite hard to get to the point where you become recognisable, because you kind of, you have to give up essentially because you can't sustain a career around other responsibilities. So Jeffries talks about this, says that comedy is loaded with uncertainty and innovation, and I think we often, we've had a lot of these discussions around lots of other creative industries, but I think comedy, I think it's a good time to talk about some of these issues, because I think for an industry that's been really heavily impacted by the pandemic, it would be nice to think that we were coming back to an industry that was more conscious of some of the structural issues that were in place. So these are just a few examples. This is the Manchester Comedy Club, the Frog and Bucket. It was denied funding last year in the DCMS Cultural Recovery Fund because it was deemed not culturally significant. And this is a club that's kind of often been the training ground for a lot of the comedians that we now see on TV. And not having that funding takes away those kind of opportunities for people to kind of really start out. So again, we can think about the impact that these things have. The grassroots has an impact on what happens further up the chain as well. And this is something from the halcyon days when the Fringe was happening. And this is Nika Burns, who was the comedy ward boss, and she basically rejected in a speech the idea that we should have better conditions for those that are working in the Edinburgh Fringe. The Edinburgh Fringe, obviously, for those that might not be aware, is a month-long festival that happens in Edinburgh, shockingly enough. It has thousands of shows, not just comedy, also kind of theatre and dance and music. But it kind of sustains itself on a lot of volunteer work and a lot of unpaid work. And for a lot of people that take shows up to the Fringe, it costs a lot of money. So it can cost up to £8,000 to £10,000 to take a show up for a month. Then obviously there is the time impact of the fact that you are not working a paid job for that time. So there's been a lot of discussion recently about kind of increasing the amount of fairness in that system, so that people that wouldn't be able to go up to the Fringe because they are working class and they don't have the money, or because they are a parent and they cannot, they don't have the ability to kind of not parent for a whole month. But but this has been, so Burns was really pushing back against some of that. And I found her, so I thought the way she framed the Fringe as this kind of halcyon space was really interesting, because I think this kind of is some of the kind of the objections that people come up against when they campaign for a fairer industry, because there was just this assumption that there is an exceptionalism because it's so fun that, you know, you don't need to think about working conditions or kind of access, because it's just so fun that you should feel privileged that you've spent £10,000 being there. So she says, for performers, it offers incredible career opportunities. For everyone else, it's not just a temporary summer job. I know many people with successful careers in entertainment who started here, work in front of house, on street teams, really mucking in. It's a life-changing experience. Should all this opportunity to participate be eroded or taken away through restriction and limitation? No, it's a month, it's a festival, it's a celebration, it's insane and marvellous. Then we all go back to the real world, to study, to work less hours, better pay, better conditions, but not half as much fun. Where else in the UK can you just get up and do it? And again, I think there is something really interesting about the way she aligns the fact that you can't just get up and do it. You can get up and do it if you've got the cash reserves to do that. You can't just get up and do it if you don't. You know, you can't get up and do it if you work at a job where, you know, if you work at Tesco and Tesco are not going to give you a month off in August. So there are layers of privilege that mean that access is easier for some than others, that are often missing in some of these discussions from kind of people within the industry like Nika Burns. So that was kind of where it came from, really, my interest. And, you know, Fair Fringe were kind of set up to provide a fairer deal for fringe workers. So just a brief thing about the structure of the industry then. So you've got kind of open tens, which are for beginners. Established comedians might use them to try out new material. They're almost always unpaid. You kind of do them as a kind of like, you know, often people talk about it in terms of paying your dues. You have an opener or a headliner, and they tend to be more established and they are paid. You've got an MC or a compere, and this can be a specialism and it does also tend to be paid. Then you've got a bucket split, which is donations on exit. You'll regularly see these at things like the Fringe Festival, and you're just kind of hoping that enough people come and enough people put in a decent amount of money that you come out with some sort of profit at the end of it. You've got gong shows, which are competitions with the cash prize. And essentially you give them 5 minutes guaranteed, and then you are gonged off if you're not making people laugh. So it's quite a kind of adversarial setup. And then you've got pro lineups, so places like the Comedy Store, the Glee Club, just the Tonic in Leicester and Nottingham, which are kind of for, you know, professional lineups. So findings then, a lot of these are quite, you know, anyone that does work in the creative industries probably know a lot of this. There is an expectation that you'll lose money gigging, so a lot of the discussion is around paying your dues, the idea that you will gig up and down the country for the experience. A lot of it is admin, so a lot of it is essentially you reaching out to promoters, asking if there's space, or sending your CV along to promoters, unless you have an agent. I found that there was some discussions around the limitations of festivals like the Leicester Comedy Festival, and the idea that they could have a benefit year round. So there was maybe this sense that people came in for the festival, but then that kind of, there wasn't anything built upon that for the rest of the year, maybe for those that were kind of local to the area. Financial risk is massively on performers, so you lose money to make money, but only if you're lucky. So one of my interviewees describes the Edinburgh Festival as like a trade fair, but obviously that is a trade fair that's all been paid for by the performers. And it's incredibly opaque, so it's unclear how to access some opportunities. A lot of it is based on word of mouth, and a lot of it is based on kind of networks that you develop. And this has implications, especially for women in the industry, who often find it more difficult to become part of those networks, because there is still a lot of the kind of old boys club attitude there. And so this is a quote from someone that was talking about the last recession, and was talking about the way that the industry kind of contracted. And he's saying that, you know, So I was starting to be tired, was the point when the recession hit the comedy circuit and everyone got pushed down a level. So all the people that had been on multiple weeks, ones could potentially have gone on tour, they had to go back to the circuit. And then the people that are already on the circuit, they had to go to like local, regional club gigs. And all the people that weren't doing that, they had to go to do middle spots rather than headlining or whatever. So we can see how it's all, you know, it is kind of a ladder system. So if things start to contract, people move back down the ladder, and then that essentially has a big impact on those that are kind of at the bottom of the ladder, essentially. And this is another quote from this same interviewee, and they're talking about a promoter who had asked them to come and do a show that was quite far away from where they were, and were basically saying, and they said no, but he says that in retrospect, he thinks of it as a reliability test. So basically, because he didn't say yes to this opportunity, he was never booked by this promoter again, because he was then seen as kind of, you know, not wanting it enough, or not just, you know, not kind of, you know, ambitious enough for it. But he's saying, you know, I literally couldn't afford to go and do that gig for £100. And whereas if you've got other paid work, which at the time I did not, that becomes less of an issue. And you go, yeah, fine, I can write off that by doing this gig on Tuesday or whatever. But all my other gigs, right, either unpaid or like £20 or £50 or whatever that moment. So this idea that you are constantly having to decide whether things are worth it, but the flip side of that is that the promoters are not necessarily seeing that as indicative of your financial decision making, and more is how much you want it. And we can see again how whether consciously or unconsciously, you know, that means that for those, you know, especially from working class backgrounds, you are going to be seen as kind of not wanting it enough, simply through the fact that you can't afford it, when those are not the same thing. So I think again that's something that's come up in a lot of discussions. And I think this quote from Culture in 5 for You kind of really emphasises that, you know, this idea that for women, people of colour, and those from working class origins, we see earlier exits from cultural labour markets that might otherwise have happened. And I think that, you know, I think that's essentially the crux of it, is if you have got this system which is highly competitive but relies very much on unpaid or paying for your, you know, either unpaid labour or paying towards you being able to access opportunities, then we can see the kinds, you know, who's going to get missed out of those opportunities. And, you know, they tend to be those that are already underrepresented within the cultural and creative industries. And then the second thing that's come out of findings so far is in relation to gender. And again, I don't think a lot of this will surprise a lot of people, but I think it was striking how much this kind of came up and how much it didn't come up when I interviewed some of my male participants, but it came up quite quickly when I interviewed some of my female participants. So there was experience of women was slightly different, and there was very much this expectation that there can only be one woman at a time. So you could have one woman on a bill, but if you had more than one, that was too much. And so women were very much constructed as a genre. So just as you might have one slapstick comedian, or you might have one satirical comedian, women are like, you know, the one, you know, the one on the bill, rather than, you know, God forbid, assuming that we can have more than one woman. And that kind of really came up. And this has been seen in kind of research going back to Calvin Kears-Bores in 2010. You know, this idea that, you know, in her interview, she spoke to people that said things like, you know, this is our sexism coming out here, because we couldn't think of any lady comedian that we find funny at all. And so obviously we're 10 years on from that article, but we're still kind of coming up against some of these same barriers to women in the industry, alongside what I think is performative inclusion. So this idea that we can have a woman to kind of tick that box, but any more than that is too much. And Katherine Ryan, the comedian, I think made a really interesting point in her podcast, telling everybody everything. And she's talking here about Mock the Week. And she's saying that she used to do the show, but she had to stop doing it because I knew every time I was booked on that show, I was taking food out of the mouth of another woman. I was never taking Jamie Acaster's spot. I was never taking Ed Gamble's spot on that show. I was always 100% of the time taking a job away from one of my female peers. So we get in this sense here that women are constantly being put into competition with each other. And there is this sense in which there are limited numbers of spots for women, so that if you become successful for Katherine Ryan, you are, as she's saying here, she's taking the food out of the mouth of another woman. I think what's interesting in here, though, is that also Ryan is taking responsibility for that by taking herself out of the running. She's not thinking, well, wouldn't it be nice if, maybe some of her male colleagues did a bit more of that legwork? Wouldn't it be nice if, I'll only use their names because they're in here, but if James Acaster or Ed Gamble kind of, push more for more women. So I think there was another issue here about the fact that often it's women that are kind of heading these initiatives, and that becomes another form of kind of labour that that is not expected from their male counterparts. And this is from one of my interviews with a woman who she's talking about her experience basically responding to what she felt like were sexist jokes. So she's talking about a particular thing that she saw, and she said, no, I was quite uncomfortable with what the male comedians were joking about. It was about femicide, it was about periods, which is ironic because women are not allowed to joke about periods, but if it's a man, apparently that's fine. And it just didn't feel right. So I mistakenly put something on my Facebook page, which led to, basically I pulled it out when I should probably have just emailed the promoter. But anyway, I learned from that, there was a lot of anger from male comedians sort of saying women aren't as funny as men or not as the same standards. And she says they're not, there aren't as many comedians as men, which is partly true, but they are still out there. And this particular interviewee is actually the promoter of an all women's comedy night, like where all of the kind of acts are women. So she kind of, I guess she can use her success to kind of, disprove what they're saying, which suggests that there are women out there if you look hard enough. So in terms of practical implications, it privileges those with disposable income or those who are time rich or in flexible employment, which again has kind of implications in terms of both class, but in terms of, kind of those that have got caring responsibilities. If you do have that expectation that you will be willing to travel up and down the country for 50 quid and then go back to work the next day, there's no guarantee at all of return on investment. So as much as Nika Burns talks about Edinburgh as this land of opportunity, a lot of the people I spoke to, Edinburgh really wasn't that for them. Some of them did it because, because they had a deep affinity with the festival, but a lot of them were like, you don't go there because you want, to get on TV, because the competition is just too huge, that you're not going to get that out of it. I also found that it was difficult for those that didn't go to the Fringe to make that leap to longer shows that were more likely to get seen by those within the industry that had more influence. So there was the risk that you would get stuck on the circuit, which for some comedians is fine, that's what they are happy with. But for those that did have aspirations for things like TV, it was quite difficult to be seen because you weren't going up to Edinburgh, which is where all the commissioners were. And obviously it's no coincidence that around the same time as the Fringe, there was also the Edinburgh Television Festival. So, if you're not there, then there is maybe the sense that you are kind of missing out. And precarity is just easier for those without caring responsibilities. And that means potentially fewer women, because they tend to be the ones that shoulder most of those responsibilities. And also, I think finally, in terms of that, the industry as a late night economy, as part of the late night economy, it assumes for women being out that late at night in itself is a risk. So often, you will finish a gig at 11 o'clock, and it's too late for public transport possibly, so you are walking home, or it's, or you're getting a megabus because you want to save money, or, or there is a kind of an assumption that you will, stay at a promoter's house to save on kind of hotel bills, but obviously that's a much different proposition for women than it is for men. And so again, that's the kind of thing that that maybe doesn't seem obvious, but it's also an issue. And just to kind of, just to end on some sort of positive note, in terms of fixing that, we can talk about more things to kind of encourage the Arts Council to consider comedy as something that's worth funding. I don't know how far we are to that, and I think there are still issues about what kind of comedy would be funded and how kind of class and race would impact on that, but that's a possibility. more initiatives support comedians to actually go up to Edinburgh. Again, I'm kind of ambivalent about that because I think that still reinforces the idea that Edinburgh is this kind of, this idealised place. We can think about codes of practices for paying conditions and unionisation. I think the Live Comedy Association is a massive step in the right direction in that respect, but they're not a union, and they do have a mixture of comedians and also promoters involved in that. So there are obviously potentially conflicts of interest there. And then there is the concept of HR. So some comedians, so Nina Gilligan and Kiri Pritchard-McLean, have started an initiative called Get Off, which is them essentially saying that they want to kind of ask venues to put some money in to basically engage with an independent kind of third-party HR professional, so that people have someone to go to if there are issues, because at the moment, obviously, that isn't there, and for women that have been harassed, for example, that puts them in a really difficult position. And then over in and then Ruth Hunter as well has set up something called the Comedy Safety Standards, where she's working with Good Night Out to essentially see if there are ways in which we can, almost like a kite mark, so that clubs can say that they have took part in this initiative to create a more supportive space for women in particular. So there are kind of things happening. And that's perhaps a nice optimistic note to end on, given that a lot of the discussion has been quite pessimistic. But yeah, I'm going to start presenting. I'm really happy to answer any questions anybody may have.
Great, thank you.